The answers just have to catch up.
Next on Eternal Durdles.
Hey, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our Patreon supporters out there. Thank you to the Durdle Maniacs. If you want to be a Durdle Maniac, go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles and help support the channel. It keeps things going. It keeps things updated. Thanks so much for watching. On with the show. Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach.
Yeah.
You know, man, we were
Tell me.
texting about what this episode was going to be about. And
Indeed.
I was messaging and I was like, man, nobody gives a damn about what I'm doing, dude. Nobody cares. And by nobody cares, I mean, don't get me wrong. You know, there's our cult following is alive and well. But nobody, we sit down across the table from each other, right? I have 90s MTG to thank for people recognizing my playmat. They know that they're about to sit down against a dude playing Deduce. And they are cordial, they're nice, they're respectful, and they don't give a shit, dude. They don't respect anything I'm doing. Now, when I say they don't respect anything I'm doing, I don't mean like, oh, personal disrespect. I mean that they play in a way where they just don't fear or care about anything. Their behavior changes not at all. You want to know what I have to do when I sit across down the table from somebody? Somebody plays a one-drop threat, and then I go, oh, great. I have to think about Daze and Wasteland and all of these other tools that change my behavior that I gotta respect. I gotta play in a way where I respect what they're doing.
Sure.
Nobody does that with me. Nobody respects counterbalance. Nobody's respecting terminus out here in these streets because all these threats hit too hard or replace themselves. They don't. It's like, cool, sweet, my poor dude. It doesn't matter. I still got a full grip because all my cards replace each other. Or I don't even have to extend into a terminus because this threat's going to kill you by itself. Too strong. What do we do, Zach? What do we do?
Well, first off, Happy New Year. This is the first episode of the new year.
Zach, it's a new year and we got problems already.
New year, old Phil. Yeah, so I think one of the there's a couple things, and I want to frame this episode in sort of a way that's like, you know, this is not so much a strategy episode, but a mentality episode, right? There's a couple things that need to change for Control to be good again in Legacy. I think.
I want to extend that too. That this is also for players that aren't playing Control. That you probably already know, but may not necessarily have intuited or thought too deeply about what is the thing that is altering your opponent's behavior. If you're a Dark Depths player, if you're an Ancient Tomb player, if you're the Days Wasteland players, like what is the actual things in your deck that are actually informing your opponent's behavior in a way that whether or not you have those tools as known information, the fact that they are present in the game in any capacity means that your opponent's behavior is changing. So like, as much as we're going to focus on Control, because Control is the one that needs significantly the most help, down to 30% or whatever, and across all EWs with a horrible performance. Thanks, Matt Chow, for letting us know that. We are going to talk about what are the cards in all these different archetypes and decks that are seeing play currently that are what essentially your opponent has to respect or play around from the jump. Yeah. Now, this is different from the initiative. This is not what's giving you the initiative. This is like deck building before you sit down. When a player sits down, if somebody goes turn one, land Delver, suddenly their behavior is going to change, not necessarily based on the Delver, right? Like if you go turn one Elvish Reclaimer, they have to think about what they need to respect, and it's not necessarily Elvish Reclaimer, right? You all intuit what we're talking about. And so that's, if someone goes turn one and plays Shuko, you know what you have to do, so.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an interesting point, Phil, because for me, on pivoting decks and figuring out what I wanted to play for Eternal Weekend, when I finally settled on Cephalid Breakfast, I had a couple styles of play I wanted to kind of pursue when I was doing this the 100 games testing for Eternal Weekend. And the initial 50 games, I wanted to play as brashly and recklessly as possible to see what people would do to answer my combo, to see, luckily I don't have to pay for Magic Online thanks to Daybreak Games giving us that God account. So I get to see what, without losing money, I can see what people are able to do against me, right? So I think one of the things that players need to think about doing is changing up their style of play. Like, just period. Understanding that, like, your style of play may not be the most optimal way to play X, Y, and Z deck. And that can go for Delver, that can go for Miracles, obviously for Cephalid Breakfast, the deck that I was playing. But I think that if you're looking for the biggest paradigm shift in your win percentage, changing up the way that you approach a deck and what you think aligns is the most important thing. If you're on a losing streak, might actually benefit you the most. And so to bring that all the way back to the control situation, I have to ask you the question, Phil. Have you just tried, like, I know this is going to sound crazy. Have you tried slowing it down and not playing into Daze? Have you tried more basics to not play into Wasteland? Stuff like that. I know the answer to these questions, but I think it behooves the audience to hear them from you.
Yeah, and this is also this particular question, which is something that Zach and I have been bouncing around a bit as we've been talking about different things. I've been exploring different builds and getting Zach's thoughts on them. And what I have found for a while, but able to articulate it, is the playing more basics or playing around Daze. Playing around Daze is available if they don't have a threat clocking you on the board already. Playing more, basics can only happen if your deck is built in such a way that it does not come at the cost of being able to cast your spells at more or less the earliest opportunity, assuming that they are actually deploying to the board, which is what their deck is now designed to do with, at least 8+1 drop, heavy hitting creatures. So what I found is playing around Daze, if you're on the draw, you really just don't even get to do it. If you're on the play, it's a luxury, assuming that they have a slower start. Playing more basics to get around Wasteland presumes that you are able to cast your spells inherently with only those basics. And if you're, moving towards a certain game plan of anything that costs more than 2, that you have to then be able to operate on exactly a specific fetch sequence, which means that you also need to open the correct fetch lands to get the basics, unless you're playing Prismatic Vista. And so what that essentially means is both of those things operate on the notion that you can play around those things, assuming you have time. But the threats in Delver and with the speed at which they can deploy and get you dead, or filter their draw in such a way to help get you dead, to narrow that squeeze, is so much that the opportunity to take time to develop is narrowed. Now, if they were only going to hit you for 1, or hit you for something light, or they had 2-drop threats like Young Pyromancer days of old, where like it's time to develop the threat, the intensity of that threat. But now that they don't, right, all of their threats are going to be chunking you for 3, or all of their threats, a Murktide is going to come down and be able to one-shot you, like they can flash in Bowmaster, not having to worry about like timing to deploy it, because they just get to do it when it's convenient for them, and they have the narrative, so you have to respect it. Like all of those things combined make it feel as though when I try and do that, like, oh yeah, just play around it, just play more basics, like do the things that have always been what are the ways to play around these tools that have been in the format forever. The threats have made it such that the opportunity to do that is so squeezed or so narrow that doing so is just as punishing as not doing so.
All right. Well, that brings me to my next point. This is a perfect segue to my next point. Then the answer really has to come from the top, right? Design has to change in such a way that the answers are as effective as the questions, right? So, perfect example is like, let's take a card that's modular, right? What is that? Natural order, not natural order. Just pick your poison is a nice modular card, right? It does like several different things, and it can answer specific things. I forget, what is it? Enchantments, artifacts, and flying creatures.
Yeah,
I want to say. So a card like that is is interesting, but it's a sorcery, right? So what we need to see is design come up, and this is the funny thing to me is that we never see design. Like, when's the last time you saw an answer get banned?
Well, yeah, answers inherently don't get banned because answers can't win the game.
Yeah. So
Now,
here's the thing: when you bring this up in conversation, you say, "Hey, they need to." They need to reprint X, Y, and Z into modern, or, like Swords, Plowshares in modern, or Counterspell in modern, like or even, Mana Drain, unbanned Mana Drain, right? And people lose their minds because they're like, oh, but if that happened, then the format would be blah, blah, blah. But like, the real answer is that the cards in the format already that make it necessary to unban those cards are actually the issue, right? And I'm not saying never have those cards. Like, I'm saying, oh, ban Murktide Region and Uro and like every, the cards that we're not even talking about anymore, right? What I'm saying is that Wizards needs to begin to learn to print answers that broadly affect the metagame, right? You need to be able to be like, okay, we're going to print Swords to Plowshares with a disenchant attached to it, let's say. Something like that. I'm not saying that's the exact design, but like, you need to be able to create something that, almost like Prismatic Ending. Prismatic Ending would be the perfect answer if it was at instant speed, right? Because then you have the ability to do what you need to do in a control deck, but you don't have to wait until your main phase to do it. You can do it at the end of turn and untap and then hold up mana for, whatever you want to do. So I think top down is where control is going to be tested the most, is whether or not in the next 3 to 5 years we continue to see threats get ramped up to a point that you can't answer them, or if we start to see the pendulum swing back, and the pendulum is almost here, right? And then it has to swing all the way back, and we have to see some answers, in the style of Abrupt Decay, in the style of Assassin's Trophy, stuff like that.
So this is where I think we have, like, I agree that implicitly answers are less powerful than threats because answers can't win the game, and answers are reliant on something happening before. They are inherently reactive, right? Mm-hmm. So even if, like, and even threats that are designed also to be answers, like Orcish Bowmaster is supposed to be, quote, the answer to or the punishment for players trying to draw cards, but it also just happens to be a flash threat on its own that then has that static, so it's not only an answer, but it's also the threat that kills you. So it's doing all of the things all at once. What I differ on is I don't think that necessarily the answers have to get better because they're like, I mean, yes, they should, but they won't, because the best things that they can print are the best thing is already Swords to Plowshares for what they can do. And the only way that they're going to
improving on that design anytime
they're not going to make Swords to Plowshares that also scries or,
or that, like Vendetta your opponent instead of gain some life.
Yeah. Like they're not going to increase the thing in that space unless they were to be like, okay, we'll make a 2-mana Swords to Plowshares that then does some additional effect, in which case you're paying 2 mana to deal with something. And the format of Legacy is already in such a way where to spend 2 mana to remove a thing, you only get in space of like something like you said, an Abrupt Decay where it's guaranteed, or an Assassin's Trophy that also can go after non-creature permanents. Like if it's like exile target creature, if it was just Swords to Plowshares text and it was 1 and a white and also had some tacked on effect, unless that tacked on effect is some modal something, right? Yeah. Like if it also, like you said, is a disenchant or whatever, it's not going to see play if it doesn't have modality, or if the effect is like cantripping, which they would never do because they have never done it, and nor would they. So my POV on like what control would need in order to like actually get through this, combo centric metagame where games are getting a lot faster and threats do a lot more things and cards are only going to be getting more powerful over time. That's not slowing down. We're going into, Universes Beyond era. And
I want to preface that Universes Beyond thing with those cards have to go through standard now. It's not hopefully not going to be as crazy.
it has to go through standard, but standard is also getting increasingly more powerful because all the cards have way more text than standards of old.
They are writing
They're
books.
not going. Yeah. They're not going to have Marvel cards with like maybe they'll do the thing that they did with Lord of the Rings,
Professor X with banding.
Well, there'll be like 6 different versions of each character, and one of those versions will be like the souped up power level, like insane thing, and then the other ones they can sort of temper a bit. But like, I don't think any of that is really what Control needs. I think what Control needs is what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode. They need to print something that informs the behavior of somebody having to respect the macro type before they sit down at the table. Now, we talk about Sensei's Divining Top a lot, but inherent in Sensei's in Countertop was if you went into a tournament and you expected Countertop to show up in any form, whether that was in old days where High Tide would board into it, or any of the varying Control decks, or what have you. Before you get to that tournament, you have to respect Countertop.
Yeah.
And to respect Countertop demanded certain kinds of answers or reactions. That kind of reaction was playing Abrupt Decays, playing some kind of timing to ensure that that combination doesn't stick, playing something like control players ended up playing Predicts to try and like mess with each other's counterbalance. Like there were certain cards and certain ways that people had to navigate the format that respected this thing before you even got there. In the way that people have to respect Days Wasteland before you get there, in the way that people have to respect Entomb Reanimate before you even get there. They have to respect Darkness that they expected, Ancient Tomb / Chalice of the Void if they respect it. Now you can pick and choose what you don't want to respect, right? Like if I go in and be like, okay, if I run into Eldrazi playing Chalices, I'm just going to fold to it. I'm going to concede that matchup. If I run into Ubisoft spells, I'm just going to concede that matchup. Like it's not enough for me. I'm just going to concede Storm. I just don't think I'm going to play against it. If you're making a metagame call, that's one thing. But if you expect to go into a tournament, if you were to think about what Control is that you'd have to respect, there isn't anything. Right now, there just is not anything other than you could argue up the beanstalk.
I mean, sure, up the beanstalk. Actually, I was going to say one of the reasons why I like the deck that I'm currently playing is because I get to play the Control strategy with a back pocket combo, 2 back pocket combos.
You're not playing Control.
I'm not, but like I am playing it like a Control deck.
You can have Control elements in your Control deck, but nobody is when they're thinking about you. Before going into an event, they're not thinking, "Oh, I have to respect the Control elements of Cephalid Breakfast."
I mean, I'm gonna tell you right now. I don't care whether or not my opponent feels like they're playing against a Control deck and makes a decision based on that. What I care about is am I going to beat them? So
I'm saying inherent in if like you before they sit down, they're thinking to themselves, okay, Cephalid Breakfast is one of the top decks.
Sure.
I have to have a plan and respect Cephalid Breakfast. Therefore, my deck building considerations and the tools that I bring are respecting this thing. And then when I sit across from somebody who presents themselves as Cephalid Breakfast, I have to play as though I could get comboed out at any moment. And therefore, my behavior is going to change in such a way that it does that. That happens. All of the combo decks have access to that.
Now,
Days players have access to that.
This is a side point and not really part of the conversation, but I think the problem with a lot of players is that they think that they're doing what you just said they're doing, but they don't actually know how to play against that deck.
Sure, a whole other conversation. I'm saying that like,
why am I not good against this deck? And it's like because you think you've prepared for it, but you really haven't.
If you're playing against it, but I'm saying that even if they do it wrong, they're still doing it. They're still behaving in a way that respects the thing that you're doing. Now, granted, these are legacy power level things to do, right? But they are sitting down thinking to themselves, if somebody shows me, if I play something and they go force pitch Narcomoeba, suddenly I now know what I'm playing against and have to behave accordingly, right?
Unless you're playing against Mafus.
But like, I mean, off the beaten path strategies, like, you know what I'm talking about. Essentially, I'm saying that whatever the tool that Control needs, I don't think is a more powerful answer to particular stuff. Would it be great to have a universal catch-all answer, that fits into the optimized colors? Yes. Would it be nice if it wasn't something that could get blown up like a Leyline Binding can? Yes. That doesn't, inherently like destroy your mana in a way that like it exposes it to a pillar of the format? Yes. But what it doesn't have is anything that your opponent actually needs to sit down and respect. if they know that you're like, if in a vacuum they just knew that you were on control from like somebody told them, or they just happen to know who you are, or they sat close to you
They watch
in
a
an
podcast.
earlier round, and they just know that you're on a control strategy. Like even if you're on Jeskai, whatever, they just know that there isn't anything that they have to respect. There's no behavior change that they need to make significantly, like of substance. Like if they know you have Narset or Teferi, okay, yeah, maybe they have to like think about like, I don't know, what they would do before you slam a sorcery speed 3-drop, if we even get there. But there isn't anything that control as a macro type has that anybody has to respect before they go to an event. They just don't. It doesn't exist right now. So
now,
like, in 2025,
I'm gonna push back on that. I'm gonna push back on that because with Jeskai Control, which is the predominant control deck. I don't want to throw you under the bus here, but that is the predominant control deck of the format.
I have never touted that the style of stuff that I play is the dominant control deck.
There is a combo that you have to watch out for, and that is the Narset Days Undoing or Fairy Days Undoing.
That combo is not happening. Like if we get to turn 6, the game has already happened. Like if we get to turn 6 where the control player is established and developed,
but they do have to take those into account if they're playing inside deck.
What behavior are you changing that we're getting to turn 6 and then they happen to have 2-3 drops together to kill you?
Whoa! They don't have to get to turn 6. That's the turn 4 play in many cases.
It's turn 4 with something already on the table.
It's
which means that they have a turn cycle to respond.
Yeah, if you're playing, not every deck has like creatures on the board at all times ready to attack down a.
I'm not saying that a control deck doesn't have access to win the game because they overload somebody. I'm saying that like if there's a Narset on the table, there's a Narset on the table, and then a combo piece that also costs 3 mana that they pass the turn to me before they get to execute. That I can now think, okay, I just have to fight over that until it's over. Like,
but that is an important part of
the board could be empty. And you just made your 3rd land drop, and the game could end.
Yeah, for sure. But I say all that to say this because that's what you're talking about when you're talking about countertop. Is you have to prepare for that stuff, and that is one of those situations with that particular control deck where you have to be aware and you have to be ready for that particular play pattern. And I think that no matter if it's 3 or 4 mana or turn 5 or turn 6, those are just the things to be aware whenever you're playing against those decks. One of the things I spent the last day trying to figure out, because I just haven't had this in my brain space anymore, was can your opponent really crack in on turn 2 with a Dragon's Rage Channeler reasonably for 3 damage? Let's say fetch land, Volcanic, Dragon's Rage Channeler, right? Okay. Then they can play an instant or a sorcery on their next turn, or both, and there you go. You've got Delirium. Or they can play the Mishra's Bauble and play a Brainstorm, right? They've got Delirium. So the answer is they can crush in on you.
You're forgetting a critical. I mean, in this one particular example, you're also forgetting the part where every time they did that, they also surveilled. Yeah,
not to mention days. If for free. I was just trying to think of like normal scenarios where like okay, like. If I get to do this, like if my opponent is now playing Dragon's Rage Channeler, what are the chances that they're going to follow it up with 3 damage to me on the next turn? And the chances are high. The chances are pretty high. Yeah.
High. The better design would have been every time your opponent casts a non-creature spell, you get to surveil.
I mean, why not? It could be both. It wouldn't change anything for me. Just like that's a 3/3, right? So then you have to respect that. You have to be like, okay, like, do I now that I know that like, and that's a significant amount of damage over the course of like 2 or 3 turns, right? If you're on the play, you take your first turn, you play a land, and you have 2 options. Maybe you like, oh, I'm going to swords it. They daze it, and now you're going to get Grunk for 3, and then you lost your days, so they get to take their turns. They wasteland you, and now you have no lands in play.
You can never walk into that sort of scenario because the game just ends. Now that is just highlighting a day's wasteland problem. Insert DRC with anything.
Sure.
The play pattern forever. But like in those scenarios where you were talking about, you can play more basics to get around it. It's like, okay, let's say I fetched my basic planes to try and fight over the thing.
Sure.
They have the days, so they protect the thing and they surveilled. If they didn't have a Mishra's Bauble before. So let's say the first thing that they did, they just went land DRC. I played a plains, tried to kill it. They daze it. That is now countered, and they get to surveil. So they have gone up. They still have their thing. They operate at like their curve is already optimized to play on, you know, one land,
1 to 2 lands
already.
yeah, of course.
But like, not only does that, like, that exchange isn't inherent, like, oh, you could just play around it because whatever. Let's say I didn't do that.
Well,
right?
that's the thing is, like, if you decide to play around days, you're still taking an inordinate amount of damage.
Now, if I play around, if I play around days, I take all the damage plus all of the value that they're accruing from their own surveilling by doing whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah.
Then I am also fetching in a way where if I have to save, if I want my land, let's say I open Flooded Strand and then not, and that's my white source. If I want to play around Wasteland as well, then I have to lead on what would be presumably be my basic island source.
Yeah.
And then cantrip. If they want to daze the cantrip just to start fueling their Dragon Rage channeler, they can. That then would stymie my development to line up my tools. Then if I play my fetch land and then, you know, get my basic planes and then fight over the thing on turn 2, they have now done a turn where is that even a relevant thing anymore? If I don't then optimize by playing a second cantrip to like further what my development for the next turn is going to be off the basic island that I just got, now I'm porting myself, and that waste of mana is something that I may not be able to afford because on their turn 2, they could just deploy another threat or you apply so much pressure that I don't even have time to utilize a cantrip anymore before taking, you know, damage where I'm already down to half my life. You know what I'm saying? Like,
and we talked about this yesterday when I was looking at your deck list and I suggested Supreme Verdict as an answer to this, and it all comes back to
if you even get to 4 mana.
Good luck getting to 4 mana because now, like, also Wasteland exists. Yeah, so
now, this is a specific instance where like. This is talking about really aggressive threats that are costed at 1 mana that you can never actually trade up with. They will only ever trade at mana parity, and they're chunking you for however much damage that they get before you get it off the table.
Sure.
And that design of that deck is to get you low enough, similar in spaces where like of Days of Old they would get you low enough to like go bolt or bolt. Now they just get you low enough to get you dead with 1 Murktide that they can protect for a turn cycle and get you. Right.
Yeah.
So like Murktide or Price of Progress or whatever, like the big finisher is, like the life total that is critical that they have to get you down to is a lot higher than it was of old, where it's like I can't fetch down to 3 because then I'm I could be dead.
Bolted, yeah.
Whereas now it's like, okay, well you can't really fetch down to fucking 7.
Yeah.
But that aside, that's where like when I sit down and I play, if somebody is playing, you know, that type of strategy, Blue Red Delver or whatever, and they play a Tamiyo, I think that like anybody who's playing Tamiyo in the blue-red decks in their main board, I think you should reconsider. Tamiyo is threatening because the ultimate is threatening, but you know what's more threatening? Your life total getting jumped.
I've never seen a Tamiyo ultimate. And
even if you don't,
100+ games I played practicing for Eternal Weekend.
Inherently, what matters about the Tamiyo thing is
it's card advantage.
Like it's card advantage. If you're playing in a matchup where card advantage matters. Now, if you're playing against, like, let's say you and I sat down, you're playing the new Delver strategy that, you know, with red kicked back in because of the recent bans.
Of course.
I'm playing an actual stock, whatever the, you know, agreed upon top control list that is, you know, viable these days is. And we sit down and you play a turn 1 Tamiyo. Now, you're not taxing my life total, but every turn you're making a clue.
Sure.
Now, that implies that we're going to spend turns where our life totals are not in danger.
Yeah.
And you're going to make clues. And then if you're going to spend time cracking those clues and using your mana, in which case that is time.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. It is anti-tempo to be playing Tamiyo, especially against a deck that wants to go long too, right? Because at the end of the day, what you can do with mana in cards in the mid-late game is going to be much more potent than what I'm doing with mana and cards in late game. The whole concept of tempo is to end the game before your opponent can get to that level of resources, right? And there are things that have made tempo a little bit more resilient in the mid to late game. You know, looking at Murktide, looking at Bowmasters and stuff like that. Sure, but yeah, I agree with you. If you're not playing a damage-based threat on turn 1 and instead playing Tamiyo, I think, you are probably doing it wrong. Especially if you don't have a backup late game plan like, you know, Reanimator had, where it was like, yeah, sure, I can play Tamiyo on turn 1, and then on turn 2, I untap and I reanimate a guy, right? Or like late game, I reanimate a guy, you know? those are all things you can do with your mana that are more potent in the mid to late game as well. Where you have a legitimate strategy in the late game to like get you back into the game, as opposed to like, oh, my opponent lasted until turn 5. The game is significantly favored for him now.
I want to get us back on track.
Sure.
What is it that you think? Do you think control to get back into a reasonable place in the metagame, as opposed to a 30% against the field player, which is the gentleman's agreement that we're just going to be the scrubs?
Yeah.
What is it that I think control needs the new tool that can garner something that you have to respect before you sit down, in lieu of countertop, the thing that your opponent needs to actually respect going into an event. What is it that you think control as a macro type would need? Like, what is, if it's a card or cards or new strategy or what is it that isn't going into Days Wasteland? Because once you go into Days Wasteland, you're not control anymore, you're tempo.
I'm going to answer your question with a question, Phil. What is the number one hardest thing about playing control? The number one hardest thing about playing control. Do you know?
Winning?
No, well, of course. In Legacy, at the very least, specifically Legacy, I think your answer is correct. But the hardest part about playing control is being able to assess the metagame, all the cards that exist in this game, right? At any one point in time, and being like, these are the best 60 to allow me to produce a control deck, right? I can answer all the questions and then finish the game in a 50-minute time frame, right? So the hardest thing really for control is deck building. When you have more cards, Phil, you have a giant amount of cards in Legacy, it becomes that much harder to answer all the questions. So I think the answer, Phil, is that it's a dead archetype. As pessimistic as that sounds, I think control going forward is a dead archetype. Now you're gonna be able to win here and there, and like Just Guy Control does good occasionally, and I'm sure like when Beanstalk figures out what it wants to do again, it'll have that. But I think ultimately it's drowning, and I don't think that based on the game.
We can agree that it is it is drowning and non-existent. The numbers from EW across here, Europe, and Japan.
I'm not saying that to discourage you, but I'm saying is that
taking it as discouragement. What I'm asking you, I'm not taking it as discouragement, and you get in the comments that we're jumping on each other. But what I'm asking isn't whether or not it's dead. What I'm asking is, okay, we both agree that it is in shambles because we have the data that shows at the biggest events of the year worldwide, the win rate for all of these decks was abysmal to the point where everybody had a losing record with any control strategy. What I'm asking is, what do you think is the tool that we hopefully get designed in 2025 that brings it back into reasonable viability?
Well, the tool would be some answer that is omnipresent. It would have to be like, like Cryptic Command for 2 mana. Something like that.
Here's where you and I, now we're getting into the meat. This is a good episode to start the year because this is different. It is not that. It is not that. And it is specifically not that because what the tool that would need to be designed to bring control back would need to be a tool that cannot be adopted into the Days Wasteland shell and be more optimal. Agreed. We've seen Up the Beanstalk create a deck, and then it's just better in a Days Wasteland shell. We saw Expressive Iteration come in, and it was just better in a Days Wasteland shell.
We saw Orcish Bowmaster come in to stop those decks, and literally
better in a Days Wasteland shell. Psychic Frog works better in a Days Wasteland combo shell. Like, any of the tool that is given has to exist in a way where it is a tool that is not just adopted by Days Wasteland being an inherently more powerful shell to build around.
Phil, I guess then the question is, give me a quality of one of those cards that would not work in Days Wasteland. Because like Tameo, I think, is a classic example of a card like that.
But Tameo is also not something that control be exposing itself to suddenly lightning bolt removing its creature.
I mean, beyond that, but like, what is the quality of a card that could do
like
that?
you essentially like Tameo also like has a whole inherent problem of like in Legacy at least your tool like that can't be a legendary creature because if you ever sit down across from a Caracas you like
Well, who plays Caracas anymore? Get out of here.
I'm saying that like if that was a tool, let's say that was a tool, like whatever.
Sure.
Let's say that hypothetically, let's say Tameo, given whatever flaws it has, is the actual answer. Let's say it's Tameo.
Right on.
Then people could just be like, okay, I'll just play a Caracas and
Start playing Caracas. I got you.
and then it doesn't matter.
Sure.
But in a way where it's like there isn't any counterplay there. Like if and also it's free. It actually does trade up. The card that like always comes back to mind, and I get that it was still years ago, and we talk about it a ton, is to me Sensei's Divining Top. Top was not a card that Delver or Tempo strategies were able to adopt in a way that furthered their strategy better than what it did for the control decks.
Okay.
If you ever saw people play countertop in their Delver strategies, which did happen from time to time,
out of the board,
out of the board, that was a pivot plan, whatever, similar to how like board into any particular kind of setup combo, whatever. Like, okay, cool, but it wasn't inherently part of their strategy that made it better. Like Days Wasteland in a if anything, anybody who has experience playing Wasteland in your top deck is actually disadvantageous because you want to spend your excess mana spinning your top to get through and find your card quality. So like, playing top plus Wasteland inherently has tension because you're going down a card and then presumably you need to, invest mana to get the card quality to get the value of the top. But without a card, like I'm saying, that, like rather than it being like, oh, we need the new answer, I'm like, well, if the new answer is just going to be some value centric answer that's going to be adopted and better optimized in Days Wasteland the way that Expressive Iteration was, or the way that Dreadhorde Arcanist was, the way that Ren and 6 was, like, okay, then we need to do something like it has to be something different, and it has to be something that can't be leveraged by a Days Wasteland deck in a valuable way. Now, Up the Beanstalk getting leveraged better than in Days Wasteland, better than Control, is because the inherent tools of Legacy, like Force of Will and shit, are naturally inclined to be in both of those decks because that's just those are pillars. It's not like Force of Will is not inherently a control tool.
And
like,
for what it's worth, some of those, like especially the Sultai decks, are playing Wasteland, are even sometimes playing Days.
They are playing Days. I'm saying Up the Beanstalk is better in a Days Wasteland shell because Up the Beanstalk isn't asking you to do anything other than play free spells that happen to have 5 pits in the corner. Yeah. So, like, that's why I'm saying that, like, Up the Beanstalk also is not the tool because it is just better in a Days Wasteland shell.
Well, I think this is a good spot to ask the listener, right? What quality do you think a card for control decks could have that would separate it from a card that tempo decks would be playing?
And that tool, whatever it may be, also doesn't need to be something entirely new. It could be something that just makes or has an interaction with something else that already exists that then makes that a powerful, a potent strategy, a potent proactive strategy. Similar to like, it's like, okay, Countertop was, a leading control strategy, but it was a proactive thing. You would cantrip to try and assemble this thing to control the game with, It didn't hard lock the opponent. There was some dancing to be done, but you could play to going, I sit down from the table, I want to establish this thing. Which is why, like, every time I ever veer away from counterbalance in any of the control decks that I play, I always feel like I'm just a shit pile of white cards with no plan and hoping that things just can line up. You know what I mean? Now,
I do.
I'm curious to what that tool is, but like, or if it's something that is designed that creates a new interaction with something that we're not thinking of. But I think that whatever that is, it needs to come around for control to be a valuable macro type. And if it's not, then it just becomes, okay, you have combo, tempo, ancient tomb as your 3 pillars, and control is just obsolete. And then it's just the gentleman's agreement of people like me who can't let it go, who are going to be the people playing at the 1-5 table.
Yeah. Well, with that said, thank you everybody for watching. Phil and I are going to record the Extra Dirtles episode. Thank you everybody for watching over December. We made it through December, which was amazing.
I get to plug into these now at the end too. We have EternalDirtles.com.
Yeah.
It is live, written content. If you want to write about literally anything, absolutely anything that you're passionate and want to write about, whether it's in legacy, pop, or pre-modern, vintage, any Eternal format, DM me or the Eternal Dirtles on any social, and hit us up on Discord. if you want to write something, you are free to. It is really easy. I'll take care of all of the editing and the build. You don't have to worry about that. All you have to do is write what you want to write about, and we can get that thoughts and that communication out
Start
to
building this community.
basic laws, and we'll build out written content again in a way that we all yearn for, similar to the days of MTG, the source, and the sideboard, and the dojo, and all those cool things that we would love to have back.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff, and we will catch you on the flip. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.